Hello friends, welcome to our story podcast. Let's begin the story The Third and Final Continent by Jhumpa Lahiri Part 1. I left India in 1964 with a certificate in commerce and the equivalent, in those days, of $10 to my name. For 3 weeks I sailed on the SS Roma, an Italian cargo vessel, in a third-class cabin next to the ship's engine, across the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean and, finally, to England. I lived in North London, in Finsbury Park in a house occupied entirely by penniless Bengali bachelors like myself, at least a dozen and sometimes more, all struggling to educate and establish ourselves abroad. I attended lectures at the LSE and worked at the university library to get by. We lived 3 or 4 to a room, shared a single, icy toilet, and took turns cooking pots of egg curry, which we ate with our hands on a table covered with newspapers. Apart from our jobs, we had few responsibilities. On weekends, we lounged barefoot in drawstring pajamas, drinking tea and smoking Rothmans, or set out to watch cricket at Lord's. Some weekends the house was crammed with still more Bengalis to whom we had introduced ourselves at the greengrocer or on the tube. And we made yet more egg curry, and played Mukesh on a Grundig reel-to-reel, and soaked our dirty dishes in the bathtub. Every now and then someone in the house moved out to live with a woman whom his family back in Calcutta had determined he was to wed. In 1969, when I was 36 years old, my own marriage was arranged. Around the same time, I was offered a full-time job in America, in the processing department of a library at MIT. The salary was generous enough to support a wife, and I was honored to be hired by a world-famous university, and so I obtained a 6th preference green card and prepared to travel farther still. By now I had enough money to go by plane. I flew first to Calcutta to attend my wedding, and a week later I flew first to Boston to begin my new job. During the flight I read The Student Guide to North America, a paperback volume that I'd bought before leaving London for 7 shillings 6 pence on Tottenham Court Road for, although I was no longer a student, I was on a budget all the same. I learned that Americans drove on the right side of the road, not the left, and that they called a lift an elevator and an engaged phone busy. The pace of life in North America is different from Britain, as you will soon discover, the guidebook informed me. Everybody feels he must get to the top. Don't expect an English cup of tea. As the plane began its descent over Boston Harbor, the pilot announced the weather and time, and that President Nixon had declared a national holiday. 2 American men had landed on the moon. Several passengers cheered. God bless America. One of them hollered. Across the aisle, I saw a woman praying. I spent my first night at the YMCA in Central Square, Cambridge, an inexpensive accommodation recommended by my guidebook. It was walking distance from MIT, and steps away from the post office and a supermarket called Purity Supreme. The room contained a cot, a desk and a small wooden cross on one wall. A sign on the door said cooking was strictly forbidden. A bare window overlooked Massachusetts Avenue, a major thoroughfare with traffic in both directions. Car horns, shrill and prolonged, blared one after another. Flashing sirens heralded endless emergencies, and a fleet of buses rumbled past, their doors opening and closing with a powerful hiss, throughout the night. The noise was constantly distracting, at times suffocating. I felt it deep in my ribs, just as I had felt the furious drone of the engine on the SS Roma. But there was no ship's deck to escape to, no glittering ocean to thrill my soul, no breeze to cool my face, no one to talk to. I was too tired to pace the gloomy corridors of the YMCA in my drawstring pajamas. Instead, I sat at the desk and stared out the window at the City Hall of Cambridge and a row of small shops. In the morning, I reported to my job at the Dewey Library, a beige Fort Lake building by Memorial Drive. I also opened a bank account, rented a post office box, and bought a plastic ball and a spoon at Woolworth's, a store whose name I recognized from London. I went to Purity Supreme, wandering up and down the aisles, converting ounces to grams and comparing prices to things in England. In the end, I bought a small carton of milk and a box of cornflakes. This was my first meal in America. I ate it at my desk. I preferred it to hamburgers or hot dogs. The only alternative I could afford in the coffee shops on Massachusetts Avenue, and, besides, at the time I had yet to consume any beef. Even the simple chore of buying milk was new to me. In London, we'd had bottles delivered each morning to our door. In a week I had adjusted, more or less. I ate cornflakes and milk, morning and night, and bought some bananas for variety, slicing them into the ball with the edge of my spoon. In addition, I bought tea bags and a flask, which the salesman in Woolworths referred to as a thermos. A flask, he informed me, was used to store whiskey, another thing I had never consumed. For the price of 1 cup of tea at a coffee shop, I filled the flask with boiling water on my way to work each morning and brewed the 4 cups I drank in the course of a day. I bought a larger carton of milk and learned to leave it on the shaded part of the windowsill, as I had seen another resident at the YMCA do. To pass the time in the evenings, I read the Boston Globe downstairs, in a spacious room with stained glass windows. I read every article and advertisement so that I would grow familiar with things, and when my eyes grew tired, I slept. Only I did not sleep well. Each night I had to keep the window wide open. It was the only source of air in the stifling room, and the noise was intolerable. I would lie on the cot with my fingers pressed into my ears, but when I drifted off to sleep, my hands fell away and the noise of the traffic would wake me up again. Pigeon feathers drifted onto the windowsill, and one evening, when I poured milk over my cornflakes, I saw that it had soared. Nevertheless, I resolved to stay at the YMCA for 6 weeks until my wife's passport and green card were ready. Once she arrived, I would have to rent a proper apartment, and so, from time to time, I studied the classified section of the newspaper or stopped in at the housing office at mid during my lunch break to see what was available in my price range. It was in this manner that I discovered a room for immediate occupancy in a house on a quiet street. The listing said, for $8 per week. I copied the number into my guidebook and dialed from a paid telephone, sorting through the coins with which I was still unfamiliar, smaller and lighter than shillings, heavier and brighter than pesos. "Who is speaking?" a woman demanded. Her voice was bold and clamorous. "Yes, good afternoon, madam. I am calling about the room. For rent. Harvard or Tech?" "I beg your pardon. Are you from Harvard or Tech?" Gathering that Tech referred to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I replied, "I work at Dewey Library," adding tentatively, "at Tech." I was given an address and an appointment for 7 o'clock that evening. 30 minutes before the hour I set out, my guidebook in my pocket, my breath fresh with Listerine. I turned down a street shaded with trees, perpendicular to Massachusetts Avenue. Stray blades of grass poked between the cracks of the footpath. In spite of the heat, I wore a coat and a tie, regarding the event as I would any other interview. I had never lived in the home of a person who was not Indian. The house, surrounded by a chain-link fence, was of white with dark brown trim. Unlike the stucco row house I'd lived in London, this house, fully detached, was covered with wooded shingles, with a tangle of forsythia bushes plastered against the front and sides. When I pressed the calling bell, the woman with whom I had spoken on the phone hollered from what seemed to be just the other side of the door, "1 minute, please." Several minutes later, the door was opened by a tiny, extremely old woman. A mass of snowy hair was arranged like a small sack on top of her head. As I stepped into the house, she sat down on a wooden bench positioned at the bottom of a narrow carpeted staircase. Once she was settled on the bench, in a small pool of light, she peered up at me with undivided attention. She wore a long black skirt that spread like a stiff tent to the floor, and a starched white shirt edged with ruffles at the throat and cuffs. Her hands, folded together in her lap, had long pallid fingers with swollen knuckles and tough yellow nails. Age had battered her features so that she almost resembled a man, with sharp, shrunken eyes and prominent creases on either side of her nose. Her lips, chapped and faded, had nearly disappeared, and her eyebrows were missing altogether. Nevertheless, she looked fierce. "Look up," she commanded. She shouted even though I stood only a few feet away. "Fasten the chain and firmly press that button on the knob. This is the first thing you shall do when you enter. Is that clear?" I locked the door as directed and examined the house. Next to the bench on which the woman sat was a small round table, its legs fully concealed, much like the woman's, by a skirt of lace. The table held a lamp, a transistor radio, a leather change purse with a silver clasp and a telephone. A thick wooden cane coated with a layer of dust was propped against one side. There was a parlor to my right, lined with bookcases and filled with shabby claw-footed furniture. In the corner of the parlor I saw a grand piano with its top down, piled with papers. The piano's bench was missing. It seemed to be the one on which the woman was sitting. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed 7 times. "You're punctual," the woman proclaimed. "I expect you shall be so with the rent. I have a letter, madam." In my jacket pocket was a letter confirming my employment from MIT, which I had brought along to prove that I was indeed from Tech. She stared at the letter, then handed it back to me carefully, gripping it with her fingers as if it were a dinner plate heaped with food instead of a sheet of paper. She did not wear glasses, and I wondered if she'd read a word of it. "The last boy was always late. Still owes me $8. Harvard boys aren't what they used to be. Only Harvard and Tech in this house. House Tech, boy. It is very well. You checked the lock?" "Yes, madam." She slapped the space beside her on the bench with one hand and told me to sit down. For a moment she was silent. Then she intoned, as if she alone possessed this knowledge, "There's an American flag on the moon." "Yes, madam." Until then I had not thought very much about the moonshot. It was in the newspaper, of course, article upon article. The astronauts had landed on the shores of the Sea of Tranquility, I had read, traveling farther than anyone in the history of civilization. For a few hours they explored the moon's surface. They gathered rocks in their pockets, described their surroundings, a magnificent desolation, according to one astronaut, spoke by phone to the president and planted a flag in lunar soil. The voyage was hailed as man's most awesome achievement. I had seen full-page photographs in the Globe of the astronauts in their inflated costumes and read about what certain people in Boston had been doing at the exact moment the astronauts landed on a Sunday afternoon. A man said that he was operating a swan boat with a radio pressed to his ear. A woman had been baking rolls for her grandchildren. The woman bellowed, "A flag on the moon, boy." I heard it on the radio. "Isn't that splendid?" "Yes, madam." But she was not satisfied with my reply. Instead she commanded, "Say, splendid." I was both baffled and somewhat insulted by the request. It reminded me of the way I was taught multiplication tables as a child, repeating after the master, sitting cross-legged, without shoes or pencils, on the floor of my one-room Tolligan school. It also reminded me of my wedding when I had repeated endless Sanskrit verses after the priest, verses I barely understood, which joined me to my wife. I said nothing. "Say, splendid," the woman bellowed once again. "Splendid," I murmured. I had to repeat the word a second time at the top of my lungs so she could hear. I am soft-spoken by nature and was especially reluctant to raise my voice to an elderly woman whom I had met only moments ago, but she did not appear to be offended. If anything, the reply pleased her because her next command was, "Go see the room." I rose from the bench and mounted the narrow carpeted staircase. There were 5 doors, 2 on either side of an equally narrow hallway and one at the opposite end. Only one door was partly open. The room contained a twin bed under a sloping ceiling, a brown oval rug, a basin with an exposed pipe, and a chest of drawers. One door, painted white, led to a closet, another to a toilet and a tub. The walls were covered with grey and ivory striped paper. The window was open, net curtains stirred in the breeze. I lifted them away and inspected the view. A small backyard, with a few fruit trees and an empty clothesline. I was satisfied. From the bottom of the stairs I heard the woman demand, "What is your decision?" When I returned to the foyer and told her, she picked up the leather change purse on the table, opened the clasp, fished about with her fingers, and produced a key on a thin wire hoop. She informed me that there was a kitchen at the back of the house, accessible through the parlor. I was welcome to use the stove as long as I left it as I found it. Sheets and towels were provided, but keeping them clean was my own responsibility. The rent was due Friday mornings on the ledge above the piano keys. And no lady visitors. I am a married man, madam. It was the first time I had announced this fact to anyone. But she had not heard. No lady visitors, she insisted. She introduced herself as Mrs. Croft and by my older brother and his wife. I regarded the proposition with neither objection nor enthusiasm. It was a duty expected of me as it was expected of every man. She was the daughter of a school teacher in Beleghata. I was told that she could cook, knot, embroider, sketch landscapes and recite poems by Tagore. But these talents could not make up for the fact that she did not possess a fair complexion, and so a string of men had rejected her to her face. She was 27, an age when her parents had begun to fear that she would never marry, and so they were willing to ship their only child halfway across the world in order to save her from spinsterhood. For 5 nights we shared a bed. Each of those nights, after applying cold cream and braiding her hair, which she tied up at the end with a black cotton string, she turned from me and wept. She missed her parents. Although I would be leaving the country in a few days, custom dictated that she was now a part of my household. And for the next 6 weeks she was to live with my brother and his wife, cooking, cleaning, serving tea and sweets to guests. I did nothing to console her. I lay on my own side of the bed, reading my guidebook by flashlight and anticipating my journey. At times I thought of the tiny room on the other side of the wall which had belonged to my mother. Now the room was practically empty. The wooden pallet on which she'd once slept was piled with trunks and old bedding. Nearly 6 years ago, before leaving for London, I had watched her die on that bed, had found her playing with her excrement in her final days. Before we cremated her, I had cleaned each of her fingernails with a hairpin, and then, because my brother could not bear it, I had assumed the role of eldest son, and had touched the flame to her temple, to release her tormented soul to heaven. The next morning I moved into the room in Mrs. Croft's house. When I unlocked the door, I saw that she was sitting on the piano bench, on the same side as the previous evening. She wore the same black skirt, the same starched white blouse, and had her hands folded together the same way in her lap. She looked so much the same that I wondered if she'd spent the whole night on the bench. I put my suitcase upstairs, filled my flask with boiling water in the kitchen, and headed off to work. That evening when I came home from the university, she was still there. "Sit down, boy." She slapped the space beside her. I perched beside her on the bench. I had a bag of groceries with me, more milk, more cornflakes and more bananas. For my inspection of the kitchen earlier in the day had revealed no spare pots, pans, or cooking utensils. There were only 2 saucepans in the refrigerator, both containing some orange broth, and a copper kettle on the stove. "Good evening, madam." She asked me if I had checked the lock. I told her I had. For a moment she was silent. Then suddenly she declared, with equal measures of disbelief and delight as the night before, "There's an American flag on the moon, boy." "Yes, madam. A flag on the moon. Isn't that splendid?" I nodded, dreading what I knew was coming. "Yes, madam. Say, splendid." This time I paused, looking to either side in case anyone were there to overhear me, though I knew perfectly well that the house was empty. I felt like an idiot, but it was a small enough thing to ask. "Splendid," I cried out. Within days it became our routine. In the mornings, when I left for the library, Mrs. Croft was either hidden away in her bedroom, on the other side of the staircase, or she was sitting on the bench, oblivious to my presence, listening to the news or classical music on the radio. But each evening when I returned, the same thing happened. She slapped the bench, ordered me to sit down, declared that there was a flag on the moon, and declared that it was splendid. I said it was splendid, too, and then we sat in silence. As awkward as it was, and as endless as it felt to me then, the nightly encounter lasted only about 10 minutes. Inevitably she would drift off to sleep, her head falling abruptly toward her chest, leaving me free to retire to my room. By then, Of course, there was no flag on the moon. The astronauts, I had read in the paper, had taken it down before flying back to Earth. But I did not have the heart to tell her. Friday morning, when my first week's rent was due, I went to the piano in the parlor to place my money on the ledge. The piano keys were dull and discolored. When I pressed one, it made no sound at all. I had put 8 $1 bills in an envelope and written Mrs. Croft's name on the front of it. I was not in the habit of leaving money unmarked and unattended. From where I stood, I could see the profile of her tent-shaped skirt. She was sitting on the bench, listening to the radio. It seemed unnecessary to make her get up and walk all the way to the piano. I never saw her walking about and assumed, from the cane always propped against the round table at her side, that she did so with difficulty. When I approached the bench, she peered up at me and demanded, "What is your business?" "The rent, madam." On the ledge above the piano keys. "I have it here." I extended the envelope toward her, but her fingers, folded together in her lap, did not budge. I bowed slightly and lowered the envelope, so that it hovered just above her hands. After a moment she accepted and nodded her head. That night when I came home, she did not slap the bench, but out of habit I sat beside her as usual. She asked me if I had checked the lock, but she mentioned nothing about the flag on the moon. Instead she said, "It was very kind of you." "I beg your pardon, madam." "Very kind of you." She was still holding the envelope in her hands. On Sunday there was a knock on my door. An elderly woman introduced herself. She was Mrs. Croft's daughter, Helen. She walked into the room and looked at each of the walls as if for signs of change, glancing at the shirts that hung in the closet, the neckties draped over the doorknob, the box of cornflakes on the chest of drawers, the dirty ball and spoon in the basin. She was short and thick-waisted, with cropped silver hair and bright pink lipstick. She wore a sleeveless summer dress, a row of white plastic beads and spectacles on a chain that hung like a swing against her chest. The backs of her legs were mapped with dark blue veins and her upper arms sagged like the flesh of a roasted eggplant. She told me she lived in Arlington, a town farther up Massachusetts Avenue. "I come once a week to bring mother groceries." "Has she sent you packing yet?" "It is very well, madam." Some of the boys run screaming. "But I think she likes you. You're the first boarder she's ever referred to as a gentleman." "Not at all, madam." She looked at me, noticing my bare feet. I still felt strange wearing shoes indoors, and always removed them before entering my room. "Are you new to Boston?" "New to America, madam." "From?" She raised her eyebrows. "I am from Calcutta, India." "Is that right? We had a Brazilian fellow about a year ago." "You'll find Cambridge a very international city." I nodded and began to wonder how long our conversation would last. But at that moment we heard Mrs. Croft's electrifying voice rising up the stairs. When we stepped into the hallway, we heard her hollering, "You are to come downstairs immediately." "What is it?" Helen hollered back. "Immediately." I put on my shoes at once. Helen sighed. We walked down the staircase. It was too narrow for us to descend side by side, so I followed Helen, who seemed to be in no hurry, and complained at one point that she had a bad knee. "Have you been walking without your cane?" Helen called out. "You know you're not supposed to walk without that cane." She paused, resting her hand on the banister, and looked back at me. "She slips sometimes." For the first time Mrs. Croft seemed vulnerable.